Hello everybody, the 72172 here today, doing another video. This one's format is going to be a little bit different than the usual computer videos I do, as instead of just putting a computer down in front of me and talking about it for 10 to 20 minutes, I'm going to go over it in way more depth than I normally would. Now, your immediate reaction to this might be something of, well, your videos aren't exactly lacking in depth. What are you saying? Well, mainly the response comes from my over-paranoia-ness of feeling that my content does lack depth, even though it very well may not, and having this feeling inside of me kind of obliges me to do something about it, whether it be just an observed feeling or an actual something that needs to be fixed kind of thing. But let's get right into it. The computer we're going to be talking about today is the Dell Dimension 2400. Dell Dimension 2400 was a very popular computer, at least in my mind, released in March of 2004. As a computer, the Dell Dimension 2400 was an extremely successful addition to the Dell Dimension line, which has been around since the mid-90s. The Dell Dimension series usually composes itself of low to mid-range desktop computers in the mini tower or micro tower form factor, of which this being a mini tower. These specs do change, but my particular Dell Dimension 2400 has a 2.4 GHz Pentium 4 processor with no hyperthreading, the Intel 845GB chipset, which is true for all Dell Dimension 2400s, DDR SD RAM, 256 megabytes in this case, a 40 gigabyte hard drive, which could be either configured with 40, 80, or 120, so it's 40 in this case, a 200 watt power supply, DVD-ROM and CD recordable drives, built-in graphics with shared memory up to 256 megabytes. It's currently set at 64, seeing as 256 megabytes would take up the entire RAM in this case. Windows XP Home Edition would have come stock on this system. It had no Office Suite included, and it was priced at around $1,000. The computer had plenty of ports as well. To PS2 keyboard and mouse, the post lights that helped for diagnosing computer problems, serial port, parallel port, VGA port, 2-channel audio with a microphone in, 4 USB ports, 10 or 100 base T Ethernet, and the voice modem down at the bottom there. In the front, there's most certainly less, but having 2 USB ports and a headphone out would have been very nice. Now, it's easy for us to look at that price today and be like, whoa, that's crazy. But put it relative to the time period. Inflation was a bit lower, things were more expensive, raw materials were more expensive. It was a lot more expensive to make a single core 2.4 gigahertz processor than it may originally let on. So having a 2.4 gigahertz processor with all of the additions included, seeing $1,000 as a price point really becomes reasonable. In addition to that, by the time the CPU was used in the Dell Dimension 2400, other Pentium 4 processors had taken the top ranks as the highest performing CPU that Intel had to offer, so that lowered the price point of the CPU. As I partially said in the specs, there are other configurations, like the 40, 80, or 120 gigabyte hard drive that could be offered. There was also the choice of, in various clock ranges, Intel Pentium 4 Intel Celeron processors. I do have a Celeron example of a Dell Dimension 2400. You either had the choice of 128, 256, or 512 megabytes of DDR SD RAM. In this case, the buyer chose 256. And I'm pretty sure all of these always came with a modem, which you can see in the PCI expansion down there. In addition to the various hardware changes, there was also the choice of having a DVD-ROM CD-ROM, CD recordable, or CD rewritable in multiple 1 or 2 configurations. In this case, as I said, it has a DVD-ROM and a CD recordable. Having the dual drive configuration would have helped for burning CDs. There were other computers built and released around the time of the Dell Dimension 2400 that would have performed a lot better than this ever did. And the reason for that, as many of you may know, is the Pentium 4's total lack of any notable performance. There were AMD processors of a lower clock speed that could match this processor at a lower heat, which was huge back in the day, especially when you have a cooling solution like this. But the Wintel fervor was and has still not faded, so anybody who's anybody would pick the Intel processor over the AMD one any day. And believe it or not, back then, AMD did not suck. As I just said, AMD processors could perform equivalently to the Pentium 4 seen here at a lower clock rate. The K6, K7, and K8 architectures were the heyday of AMD. In addition to using an AMD processor to get lower heat, it would have cost less as well. AMD always prices their products lower than Intel simply because they have to do it in order to remain competitive. That left room for other things too, like an AGP expansion, which this computer does not have. You can see the artifact for it down there on the motherboard, where all those contacts are, just above the PCI slots. Having an AGP expansion in a computer like this would have been a lot better than just having the built-in graphics. And having any graphics capability in a system of this time would have been nice, but they chose not to include it, and it certainly suited well for business applications where 3D rendering was not needed. While certainly not something we would consider affordable today for a computer of this performance, back in the day this was considered cheap. Without skimping on other things such as quality, this was as cheap as you're going to get. Prior to the time that the Dell Dimension 2400 was released, Dell had built itself up with a reputation of having a very reliable build quality and had great support for their products over time. And especially having the service tag, where you could go on Dell.com and look up your service tag and get everything you could need for it. I can tell you right now, other manufacturers were not doing anything like that at the time period, so having that kind of convenience, especially if your computer decided to go and break down, would have been very nice. The inclusion of 2 CD-ROM drives too would have helped this for multimedia users, especially considering if you're a CD junkie who, enjoys their music or whatever, you can have one ripping the audio and the other burning it onto the disc. It's convenient. Now, of course, where would any video that I do be without bickering about things? The cooling design on this is not expertly designed, but I can't really totally blame that on them, but let's go into it anyway. Here we can see a more exposed view of the CPU cooling system. As you can see right there, it's a passive heatsink, but it's not totally passive. This green shroud goes right over top of the CPU, and the fan in the back pulls air over the heatsink and out the back of the unit. So it functions as the CPU cooler and as the rear exhaust. For whatever reason, the Dell Dimension 2400 does not know how to read the CPU's thermal diode. So instead of reading the heat or the temperature directly from the CPU die, it reads it on the fan, believe it or not. As the CPU heats up, the air that the fan draws will increasingly get hotter. The thermal diode on the fan reads this and will thus increase the speed. Pretty clever, but and if any of you have ever worked on a Dell Dimension 2400, you'll know that after using these for a period of years, the front of that heatsink gets clogged up. And having a cooling design that's sort of reactive, almost, doesn't really serve it well, especially when the CPU is clogged. There's also a bit of a cooling flaw in the front as well. The only intake for this is there. That little lip. There's vents under there that go into that front panel and back into the hard drive. Now that's fine and dandy, it sucks air in there, and it cools the hard drive, but that gets clogged too, and a little bit quicker than the other things do. So having no intake at all except for in between the CD drives and stuff, yeah, it can get messy. Another thing about these that are not too great is there are a great many proprietary components, because you just gotta love them. The fan, in fact, is proprietary. It's a 3-pin connector, but it's not a standard PWM connector. It's a Dell proprietary connector, and it's not just wired PWM, but has a Dell proprietary connector on the end. The interface that it works over is completely different. The protocols and everything are completely different. There's no way you can get one of these fans to work properly on a regular ATX motherboard. In addition to that fan, the front panel and front USB connectors are very proprietary as well, and they are not at all ATX, and that's annoying. That means you can't swap the motherboard. But hey, that's good for Dell. It means you get to buy another one of their computers when this one gets too old. Thankfully though, they left other non-proprietary standard components intact, such as the IDE bus, the Molex connectors and stuff like that, so you don't have to be totally trapped into having literally no expansion potential at all. Speaking of lack of expansion, let's talk about that next. Especially with this configuration, there's only two 5.25-inch bays for CD-ROM drives, both of which are filled. Having a small case like this means that you're pretty limited. There's only one legitimate 3.5-inch bay, and that's occupied by an optional floppy disk drive. So you don't really have any other room to put a hard drive in. There's only one hard drive slot, which is currently occupied by the main boot disk. So if you ever need more disk space, you're limited to buying a new hard drive and copying everything over. There is also only 3 PCI slots, which, believe it or not, can get filled pretty quickly. And especially with the lack of an AGP expansion, like I've said, graphics capability is very limited. The power supply as well is not really designed to handle high energy devices. So even if it had an AGP slot, putting a high wattage graphics card in there wouldn't have really suited very well for the power supply. Now this might be a feature that you shrug at these days, considering there are free Office products out there like LibreOffice or OpenOffice, but back in the day, the lack of inclusion of an Office suite was a huge deal. Microsoft Word was the only word processor that was legitimately good for anything besides typing words. PowerPoint, Excel, Word, Access, a lot of businesses back in the day used those, and the lack of inclusion of a default Office suite would have been quite a drawback. So, let's wrap this up. This computer being a reliable and usable computer, these things went on forever. Up until very recently, I saw these rather frequently at very many places. They go forever. 10 years plus. These things live and just work. They keep working. And that's probably part of the reason why they were so popular. They didn't die young. They just kept going. In addition to the high sales volume that Dell certainly achieved with these, they just performed well. They didn't die, and thus there was no reason to replace them. Sure, they might have gotten slow or something, but if you're a business that has 500 or 1,000 of these things, replacing all of them would certainly be quite the task. So you're going to want to keep these things going as long as possible. In fact, I worked at a business over the summer, and they just got rid of their Dell Dimension series computers. They just don't die. And having a computer that doesn't die, even though it may be slow, there's no reason to get rid of it. Even if you are a consumer, it might be slow, but say you're strapped for money. If it works, it works. Even into the 2010s, when dial-up connections were becoming really, really outdated, this has a built-in Ethernet port. So all you have to do is get an Ethernet network and you're good to go. Simple as that. the fact that the Windows XP operating system was supported for such a long time also meant that this computer could just keep getting updates and still be secure up until 2014, that is, technically. So that's about it. The Dell Dimension 2400. Computer that achieved its purpose without a doubt, and that was to make Dell money. That's what all computers are designed for in the end, yeah? If you liked this concept and think I executed it well, give the video a like. It really does help. And maybe even tell me what you like about it in the comments. It would also be nice if you can offer some criticism on what I can do in the next video. And, heck, even if you wanted to, pick a computer. I have a lot of them, so chances are if you pick one, I'm probably going to have one. So, yeah. Thank you guys for watching, and have a nice day.